Hello and welcome to my summary and commentary on Part 10 of the Introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. In this section we move to the narrower task of determining the state of Western culture as of 1800 to 2000. From the knowledge gained from Spengler's world survey, from his Copernican world history, where the West is no longer the center of our historical universe, where we're looking at all of the high cultures equally, and we're trying to draw analogies between them in order to penetrate deep into their form, rather than to be bedazzled by superficial similarities. And this is really why the whole work is called Decline of the West, because this narrower task, well, it's, in the parlance of our times, sexier. It's a more exciting topic. A theoretical topic like this historiographic question, what is world history? For a lot of people, that's going to turn them off quite quickly. Their eyes will glaze over, they'll pass out and fall out of their chair. Not you and me, of course, but this is a more interesting topic for a lot of people, assessing where the West is. And we can see this in a lot of ways today, right? I've got a friend who's an AP US history teacher. He's only interested in modern history, not interested in ancient history. So now we'll get a bit of that. So he introduces an important piece of terminology for his system, this word contemporary. So contemporary in our special sense, as he says, he doesn't actually yet fully describe it, I believe. Or maybe we did in a previous section, I just forget, but let's review very quickly. So contemporary in the Spenglerian sense doesn't mean two events occurring at the same time. It means two events that occur at the same time in the life cycle of a given culture. Or, yes. So for him, he introduced it before with things like Alexander and Napoleon. Alexander and Napoleon are contemporary because each appears in Spengler's conception at the same time in the life cycle of the culture. And we'll get some more examples of that very shortly. So he says 1800 to 2000, this Western period is contemporary with the transition from Hellenism to Rome in the ancient period. So about Alexander the Great, maybe Scipio Africanus, but even that might be a little bit later. So he says Rome is going to be the key to understanding our own future. And Rome, this civilized phase, now the culture is dead. It's the thing becoming has become the thing become. So he says, Rome, this rigorous realism, uninspired, barbaric, disciplined, practical, Protestant, Prussian. So all these characteristics are things that we would expect from civilizations in Spengler's framework. Because the civilization, you're losing that inner life force, that religious idea that creates these artistic ideas and that people are actually working with and working through. No, once we reach the civilized phase, the artistic and religious within the culture is dead. And all you have is basically power politics at that time. Now, 1800 to 2000, our phase, is going to be an ideological phase. He views these as kind of the warring states periods of each culture / civilization. To use the Chinese as the primary example there, they had a big warring states period, is very famous, Zhangguo, and this was about 500 BC to about 220 BC. So maybe this casts some doubt on how exact he is with his life cycles for these cultures, because one has a warring states period that might last a few hundred years, another has a warring states period that might last considerably shorter. Now, who knows? We'll have to see with the Western one, but the warring states period with the classical, can you really view, well, I don't know, maybe you say it's from the Peloponnesian War, so a great big war between Sparta and Athens, until when? And it's punctuated by some big stops, which, again, ours is as well, right? We had World War I and World War II, and now they've been punctuated by very prosperous and peaceful eras, but that are, what do I want to say? There's the sword of Damocles of nuclear war and of Cold War, and perhaps AI and robotic warfare kind of hanging over it, So maybe it is common for these eras to be punctuated by long peaceful periods. But he says, so Rome is a complete counterpart to the modern West, but differing in every detail of the surface. But it's entirely similar in the inward power driving the great organism toward its end. And this inward power, well, do we think of it that much as a power? Maybe. But this inward power is also could be described as the culture losing its vitality as the religious idea becomes more brittle, as the artistic ideas run out, they become exhausted. And now, like an old man, the culture limps towards its end. That's Spengler's view, and this was very attractive to people in World War I who had seen their world destroyed by this cataclysm. And then on page 34 of this edition, he lists some contemporaneous pairs between the Western and classical that I'll recite for you. So the first is the Trojan War and the Crusades. I don't think those need too much introduction or background. So he views these as these early wars for both the classical and the Western that are contemporaneous. And I'm not sure what other warlike early period wars he's able to cite from the Egyptian or the Babylonian, the Magian, the Chinese, the Indian, because, well, and yeah, maybe that's just an artifact of the evidence that is actually left to us, because, you know, we can only deal with the evidence that's actually before us, and as Spengler is going to very shortly point out, we get a very selective sample of the evidence. So Trojan War and the Crusades. The next is Homer and the Nibelungenlied. So that's these. Homer, that needs no introduction. The Iliad and the Odyssey, very important epic poems that are still read to this day. And for a lot of scholars, that kind of fills the role of the Bible to some degree for the Greeks. Now, maybe you say it's Hesiod, the theogony, how the gods were created. That is actually a more religious work or other works about the gods. But some scholars think that Homer fills a similar place to the Bible. But Spengler, thinks that the Nibelungenlied, so these are the songs or epic poems about Siegfried, and Gunther. So yeah, I don't know a whole great deal about those, but anyway, so these would be similar, and the Nibelungenlied would have been finally written down at some point in about the 13th century. Now, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these were just recited. This wasn't these were memorized. These weren't written down for a long, long time. Same thing with a lot of Indian culture. So many Indian things weren't written down until so much later. So it's very interesting how oral culture can be handed down for generations and generations, and they maintain it. They maintain these verses. It's very interesting, and you could compare to kind of Marshall McLuhan or Neil Postman's ideas about the importance of the medium for the message, because with something like oral culture, that's really a totally different task for your mind than things like I'm doing, right? I'm referring to my book and my notes in order to do this. It's nothing like the way that a Homeric orator would have to memorize these poems, and then they would perform them kind of night after night in different cities. So you'd go to like one polis, and you'd perform for maybe 4 or 5 nights. You could finally get through the whole Iliad, and then maybe you go to another one and perform. So pretty cool. So the next one, he says Doric and Gothic. So Doric as a broad term describes the area near Sparta, Lacedaemon, Laconia maybe. I'm not sure, but the Peloponnese, the Peloponnese. So this is the Doric area, a Dorian person. So this would be where Dorian Gray got his name, but must have had a real Hellenophile for a father and mother there. But so Doric versus Gothic. So Doric's also famous for the column. That's the simplest Greek style of column. And these were also made of wood back in those days. So he's comparing this with the Gothic, and those are kind of the cathedrals that you would think of as kind of high Middle Ages cathedrals. And the early architecture for any culture is very important evidence for Spengler. He thinks this is of central importance. What is their early architecture like? This is... Now, and you can ask yourself the question, do I think that's the best way to judge a culture? I don't know. I think it's a reasonable one, right? Because this is going to be well-preserved evidence. It's obviously of some great importance because why do people invest in building these great buildings? It must be something that's important to them. And why do they build it in these certain shapes, with these certain motifs and styles? And how does this express their underlying religious idea, their prime symbol? So that's very important for him. So he compares the Doric to the Gothic. Next, he compares the Dionysian movement to the Renaissance, and he'll have more choice words for the Renaissance. He believes the Renaissance was kind of affected or pretentious or kind of a poser wannabe thing. These Italian or English Renaissance or wherever else, they were looking back to the classical, trying to recapitulate what the classical had already done, but without the true soul of the classical, while having this Western soul. So for him, the Renaissance, as much as it's celebrated by most historians, for him it's kind of this false... Yeah, just a false thing, something that's not true to the culture, because we're reinterpreting all these classical symbols and classical art forms with a Western soul and imparting this kind of Western pseudomorphosis upon them. And the concept of the pseudomorphosis will become more important as we cover it. And then he says Polycletus and Bach. So obviously Bach is the great contrapuntist, the great composer, and he had this contrapuntal music, and his music kind of expresses this infinitesimal and also infinite nature of the Western soul. This music that is going everywhere and can, have the smallest little variations in tone and all of that. Expresses this Western will to the infinite, Spengler would say. Whereas Polycletus and his sculpture, he's a great, great sculptor. And Polycletus, this is a Latinized version. His real is Polycletus, something like that. So that means much acclaimed in Greek. So it's a pretty cool name. And this you see a lot with the it's funny because now it's kind of a hick name if you call someone Cletus, but this comes from a great Greek word for somebody to be famous or acclaimed. So he compares those. Now he compares Athens and Paris. I don't think those need much introduction. And then he compares Aristotle and Kant. So these are also contemporaneous. For him, Aristotle is the great systematic philosopher, closing off the true kind of systematic philosophy of the Greeks. And then you have what Spengler would consider these nihilistic schools that come in, chiefly the Stoics, but also the Epicureans. He would view them all as nihilistic because they reject the fundamental religious ideas of the ancient Greek, the Greeks that would have been more ancient to them. and they replace it with kind of this ethic of just how to live through this kind of materialistic meaninglessness. And so he compares Aristotle to Kant as contemporaries. And then the contemporary, he doesn't quite list it here, but the contemporary to the Stoics and the Epicureans, in his conception, would be the Utilitarians and the Socialists, which he brands under the broad label in his conception of socialism. So he views this as a Western nihilism. So your nihilism is going to fundamentally reject the main religious prime symbol, but it's also, in a way, going to be kind of a perverted form of it. So something like utilitarianism, it is kind of this infinite force trying to move in an infinite direction or in all directions, I could probably better say, but because utilitarianism is looking for the greatest good for the greatest number. So you can kind of see how this is kind of this, kind of funhouse mirror way of like being kind of this Viking or early Germanic infinite conqueror. But now you want to just, in a sense, in air quotes, conquer for the good. You want to spread the greatest good to the greatest number. And that's what utilitarianism, socialism, everything's trying to do. Virtually all the ideologies that have been contending in this period between 1800 and the present day, they're all these socialist ideologies in this broad sense of Spengler. Here is a point where I think he's very insightful. So, as much as, I might complain about him or have some criticism for him, I think he's very insightful with this point of this deep, what do I want to say, like interconnection between utilitarianism and socialism and these other ideologies, because they are all focused on the greatest good for the greatest number, but they all just think about it in different ways and go about it in different ways. Finally, Alexander and Napoleon, and we were already acquainted with that one a few sections ago. And then finally, he says, to the world city and the imperialism common to both cultures. So at this point, very late in the culture, now we're in this winter period for the culture. This is when you get these huge world cities, Alexandria, today London and New York, and maybe even, Shanghai and Tokyo, to the extent we consider them Western cities within Spengler's framework. But anyway, so on to the next point. He says, analogical comparison requires reinterpretation of the classical. This is very important for him, to get past the fetishism for the classical that he decries. So he says, it's got to be very different from the incredibly one-sided, superficial, prejudicial, and limited picture. Superficial similarity is a great snare. We are simply the adorers of the classical, not its pupils and successors. This is key for him. We fetishize the classical. We're just adorers of the classical. We're not its pupils and successors. We have a different soul. This is his idea. We have a different soul. Our soul is based on infinite force moving in all directions to conquer all. Their soul is different than that. And we'll get into kind of how it's a bit different, or how it's vastly different, how they couldn't be more different. These different cultures just could not be more different from each other in Spengler's conception. And here he says they're immeasurably alien and distant. The classical is immeasurably alien and distant from the Western. Maybe even more so than the Mexican gods, so the Aztec gods, and the Indian architecture. So here, this is interesting. So he's actually kind of violating his doctrinaire relativism that I've discussed in the last few episodes. Because here, he's actually saying, well, maybe the classical is even more different from our society than the Mesoamerican society or the Indian society, or the Indian culture, the Mesoamerican culture. And That's pretty interesting. So the one time that he'll violate his doctrinaire relativism is to accentuate the difference between the classical and the Western. And I think this gives us a great insight into his motivation with this doctrinaire relativism, because for him, he really wants to kill this ancient medieval modern scheme, right? We've seen that a lot. Ancient medieval modern, he hates it. He hates it because it's a linear world history that connects all these cultures as if they're on a straight line, but particularly connects the classical and the Western as if they're on a straight line. And that Spengler cannot abide, because Spengler does not want a linear history. Spengler wants a cyclical history. Each culture has its own life cycle, and that's all there is to it. And once that culture has completed its life cycle, the people within it become what he calls fellahin peoples, and they are no longer the subjects or objects of world history. What happens after that is no different than just animal forces on the savannah for him, because once the inner ideas of the culture, once the nobility has died, once the art has died, for him it's all power politics. That's when you're going to get Caesarism. That's when these great emperors and world empires emerge, and it's just all power politics, and it's all about scale and quantity, and quality has been fully destroyed for him. And so it's just interesting, though, that here's the one place where he violates his doctrinaire relativism. You know, the classical could be more different from the Western than even the Mesoamerican or the Indian. He wants to emphasize this deep difference between the classical and the Western, because that fully breaks the ancient medieval modern scheme, which is the real object of Spengler's ire. On to the next point. He criticizes two types of men here. The first type of men he criticizes are quote-unquote public men who judge the classical harshly by a Western standard. And then the second group are artists and philosophers who judge the West not to measure up to the classical. So on the one hand, you've got folks who judge the classical to be inferior by a Western standard, and then on the other hand, you've got people who fetishize the classical as, you know, this great lost golden age. So he calls the one the matter-of-fact school, the one that would put down the classical in favor of the Western. And he calls the other the Romanticists. And the Romanticists are, he thinks their best representatives are these guys from Basel, Switzerland, Bachhofen, Burckhardt, and Nietzsche. So, and particularly Nietzsche, who's a big influence on him, but he has a lot of criticism for Nietzsche. I guess kind of how I have a lot of criticism for Spengler. So, the first thing I'd note is these public men who judge the classical harshly by a Western standard. Do we think there's anybody maybe like them quite a bit today? Maybe the woke? Maybe the woke in the way they look at our founding fathers, and they want to judge them by the standard of 2020, and they want to say, you know, these guys were so fucking terrible, even though they have no idea what they would have done in those days. They have absolutely no idea. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't give a shit. They don't read. But, you know, they're sure that they're better than these people. They're better than the people that founded the country, because they're judging them by the standard of today, just as these other guys judge the classical by the standard of the West. I think it's very similar. Now you could say, well, there's a distinction there. The woke today are Western peoples. They're judging other Western peoples by the same and because they're both Western, this is all within one culture, so they can still judge them. Whereas the Westerners trying to judge the classical, these are two different cultures, and there's just this unbridgeable gap of knowledge between them, so a Westerner could never truly pass moral, ethical, aesthetic, or other judgment on the classical. I don't know, it's an idea. I'm not convinced it's a principled distinction, but perhaps I could be convinced. Anyway, He says, the one group, the matter-of-fact school, has a clever superficiality that treats social, economic, political, and physiological facts as everything, and the rest are treated as mere attendant phenomena or secondary results. And it's funny here because this, to me, this is very much an attack on the Marxists, because it's tough to read that sentence if you have any knowledge of Marxism without thinking of Marx's base and superstructure. And maybe it's utilitarian as well. There's certainly more right-wing thoughts that also are intensely materialistic and view religion, art, everything like that as merely secondary. And there's some truth to it, right? I mean, our best idea for the birth of the first sedentary populations, the first agricultural, quote-unquote, civilizations, because they're using civilization in a different way than Spengler would. But our best idea for why writing developed and why we start to get any central governments anywhere is that material standards increased because now you have river-based agriculture, and you've got a surplus of food, so now you can have scribes and priests, etc. So the material is obviously of some importance, but when you get to the Marxist point where everything is just determined by economics, or even a lot of modern American standpoints, and obviously modern America has been infiltrated by neo-Marxism, subversion, demoralization on an industrial scale. But even without that, I think you have some people who really do try to reduce everything to the economic. So yeah, that's just interesting. And then on the other hand, we've got the Romanticists, the Nietzsche camp, which he criticizes for succumbing to the usual dangers of ideology. They lose themselves in the clouds of an antiquity that is only an image of their own sensibility in a philological mirror. So philology, the study of ancient languages, that was Nietzsche's real passion. And I think this is very good. Obviously a very poetic phrasing from Spengler, and this is very reminiscent of his criticism of the Renaissance. So he's going to view these Romanticists in very much the same light as he views the Renaissance. And he says they have an over-reliance on Greco-Roman literature, which is selectively preserved, because, as we were talking about earlier, so much of their literature was passed down by oral tradition, and even the stuff that was written down, what actually is preserved and is still extant today. So he says, the Augustan age was a tired, sterile, pedantic, back-looking time, and this is when the works were really written down and preserved. So this gives us a selective sample that's not really representative of the Greco-Roman culture. And he says this is as opposed to the matter-of-fact school's over-reliance on the humdrum material of law sources, inscriptions, and coins. So, the matter-of-fact school, they like this workaday stuff that's just going to show us the daily life, the economic life of these people. And Oswald Spengler, what he wants to do, he wants to use all the evidence that these schools focus on. So he wants to use both the artistic evidence that the Romanticists focus on, and also the humdrum material of economic life that a guy like Theodor Mommsen, he wrote a very famous Provinces of the Roman Empire, kind of the first history to really try to look into the everyday life of each of the provinces, how the provinces produced economically and things of that nature. And he says that Nietzsche and Mommsen, they didn't respect each other at all. They never mentioned each other. So he wants to bridge this lack of respect between the Romanticists and the matter-of-fact school with his historiographic approach. Finally, he says, history had not revealed its specific logic to the Romanticist's dreaming gaze, yet they felt the imminent necessity of history, rather than turning their backs in despair like Schopenhauer. So again, he's always got bad words for Schopenhauer. This is another one of his bugbears. Darwin, Schopenhauer, these are the guys he hates. Goethe, and Nietzsche to a much lesser extent. These are the guys he loves. And this specific logic that their dreaming gaze has not yet gotten to, this is that logic of destiny, the destiny of the culture, the world as nature, the Copernican world history, understanding that it's the prime symbol and its instantiations and the life cycle, the fact that each culture is on a clock. That really gives it its specific logic. But he still kind of has more positive words for the Romanticists, we can clearly see here, because at least they felt the imminent necessity. And Spengler, as much as he might criticize a romantic, he's got a lot of a romantic in him, just like Nietzsche, who would criticize the same, but still has this very artistic impulse in his philosophy. Spengler's got a hugely artistic impulse in his historiography and his history. So, with that, I conclude this summary and commentary of Part 10 of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. Sorry about, any of, my speaking. I'm not feeling quite well at the moment, so I'm really trying to battle through this episode and give it to you as best I can. I hope the content's been interesting. Thanks so much for your time. Have a wonderful day. Peace.